Welcome, everyone. I'm Chris Hudson, editor of Architecture Minnesota, the regional magazine of the American Institute of Architects Minnesota. AIA Minnesota is the host of this webinar titled REWORK, Higher Education Facilities Designed for COVID-19 Safety. I'll be your moderator. We thank you for joining us live or watching the recording of this session. These are difficult days in the Twin Cities as we reckon with long-standing racial disparities in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. We know that hearts and minds are heavy, and we hope that all of you in the audience today are finding ways to grieve and listen and engage in the important work ahead of us. This session is one of a series of sessions we have organized focused on the future of design of the built environment. Sessions that have already occurred and will soon be posted on our website were focused on reworking office spaces and arts and cultural spaces. Upcoming sessions being held over the next few weeks will focus on healthcare facilities and research laboratories. You can find more information about these sessions on our website. One housekeeping item before we introduce our three presenters. We encourage you to type in your questions as you have them, using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. My colleagues Ann Mayhew and Sherry Hansen will be keeping the technology going during today's program and helping with the Q&A segment after the presentations. With that, let's get started. We've gathered a group of experts today to share their perspectives on how colleges and universities can adapt their various buildings and spaces and modes of education to make in-person classes and campus activities safer for students, faculty, and staff in the context of COVID-19. They've all been working in their own spheres to identify and address near-term risks, to bring forward ideas, concerns, and questions to keep in mind for the longer term. I think you can now see all of the folks you'll be hearing from today. Our sincere thanks to our presenters for making time for this. Joining us from the architecture community are Heidi Costello, Health Sciences and Medical Education Practice Leader and Senior Associate at Perkins & Will, and Marc Partridge. Oh, sorry, we're going in the order of the presenters. Yes, from Minnesota State Colleges and University, we're joined by Michelle Gerner, Interim Director of Capital Planning and Analysis at MnSCU, and Marc Partridge, AIA, University Architect and Capital Project Management Design at the University of Minnesota. Heidi from Perkins & Will get us started. We'll have her presentation up on screen in just a moment. While that's happening, just a quick note to all of our panelists that I'll give you a brief cue if you're running close to the end of your allotted time. With that, we'll let Heidi share a screen and you can take it away, Heidi.
Great. Can you share my screen or not yet? Can you see my screen?
Not yet. There we go.
Okay, great. Thank you all for joining. It's a privilege to be here, and I'm going to give a broader perspective of the effects of COVID-19 on campuses. We've been engaging with multiple higher education clients, doing a lot of research and discussing with our colleagues at Perkins & Will across the country over the last several months, and really just trying to understand what are they seeing, what do you predict, and how does education look long-term? So we at Perkins & Will have developed what we're calling a return to campus roadmap. We also have a microsite that we've crafted for our clients, and I'm just gonna share a snippet of that today. I can't go through the whole thing in a 15-minute time slot, but I just wanna share some of the high-level aspects of that, starting with just some of the research. As you all are aware, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization said that more than 1 billion learners were affected by COVID-19. And the American Council on Education said they're estimating a 15% enrollment drop nationwide next fall, which does include 25% decline in international student enrollment, which could cost schools up to $23 billion. And so we really want to look at how do we beat those predictions? How do we make sure that those aren't statistics that actually come true, and find creative ways to think more holistically about the future of higher education. what does that future really look like? We're all trying to figure that out and navigate that, as you'll hear today. But there's really been a lot of negative news, as you can see from some of those statistics. And so we want to look to positive solutions or strategies to really reinvigorate that future of higher education, with the ultimate goal to really resume full operations in looking at the delivery of programs and services and work. And with the understanding that COVID-19 changing every day, there's so much that is still unknown. And the approach needs to really be nimble and flexible and really allow for the variety of future conditions, because the future is extremely unclear, as we all can see. And I think the process, though, doesn't have to be. And so I'm not going to look into a crystal ball today and tell you what that's going to look like, but I think collectively we can work to craft a strategy that is really helpful for your college or university. And so many or all of you have seen this chart from the World Health Organization on the pandemic preparedness. It flows from the alert phase to the transition phase. And perhaps some of you are already starting to think about that transition phase in these summer months. But within higher education, we really do aspire to efficiently utilize the built environment, whether that's classrooms, labs, offices, and really pair that with technology as a tool for online education. But as campuses had to close very quickly in response to COVID-19 through that human contact, online education became our primary tool available, and to really minimize the disruption, which is what a lot of institutions are having, is really the current state within this pandemic phase. And now we're really starting to look at, and clients are asking and preparing to, how to look at the future and how do you re-enter the campus in this transition phase, and how do you focus on that inter-pandemic phase of more of a response to all of this. And so we need to repopulate, but we want to reimagine and not revert to the old norm, because a lot of it actually wasn't sustainable for many institutions. And so it's really looking to establish an appropriate integration of learning environments and the virtual connections, and balance that with the student safety and the well-being to really be drivers of the success. And so I think first what you need to do is actually reflect on the current state, and really then start to imagine, to reimagine what it can be, take some lessons learned from the reflection, and then begin to repopulate. So I'm going to walk through these 3 steps of what that could look like. So in the reflection process, if we really take time to truly reflect, we sometimes need to ask ourselves, what is happening right now? And when is this going to end? How can we learn from this? Maybe what's working and not working. I think there are some successes that are happening in the midst of all of this negativity. And often the reflection has more questions than answers, and actually that's okay. I believe that innovation actually occurs when really great questions are asked that make us take a step back and say, well, let's reevaluate that and think differently. So in this reflection period of where we are today, as I was mentioning, we went from the classroom-based to web-based, and many faculty and institutions lack the tools or support to get them ready. We went to really relying on software platforms. We all got really used to staring into our colleagues' homes, or even gazing back at ourselves in the monitor. And some people saw this as a temporary solution to COVID-19, but really the impact is going to be long lasting. But for some institutions, online learning doesn't work. It's really tough for some really specific trades. Training health professionals, researchers, and others that need that hands-on experience, it's really hard to just completely turn a switch to be fully online. And so the past several weeks has really challenged and tested the pedagogical capacities of physical distancing. And we also went from extremely energized collaborative campuses, one that helped set the tone for the students' memorable college experience, to really desolate, isolated campuses with a lack of that physical connectivity. And it really proved that the built environment does provide a home around these important experiential learning moments, not just for students, but also for faculty and staff. And for some, they had to go back to their hometowns or home countries and reestablish college life in a home setting. So how can we reimagine the future with all of these abrupt changes and future unknowns? And I think the first step is to collaboratively get together. We're working with clients and also seeing and hearing this to really develop a committee to create a roadmap for return. And for some college leaders in the midst of this pandemic, there's really no such thing as too much transparency. Everyone from leaders, faculty, staff, students, even parents and coaches, everybody's experiencing a different level of new normal. And so really engaging all perspectives is going to be critical. And like I mentioned, we're seeing this with some of our clients, and I was reading that Boston University published that their plan is really to get support from a multiple, what they're calling working groups. And so some are remote and online working groups. They have a graduate professional program, undergraduate, a research work, and student resident life work group. And that is what is making up their committee to really reinforce what is this going to look like to optimize a broad perspective and get that input from multiple people. And so within that roadmap, I think first of all, it's really developing what that framework is. And a lot of that is trial and error, testing things out. But there's also operational procedures that need to change, and then making sure that there's really strong collaboration and within communication and behavioral strategies. And so I'm just going to walk through what maybe a roadmap to return might look like for an institution, starting with a framework. And so when we take a look at this, it might start out taking an approach of something that might feel short-term in the beginning, really looking at how do we be fully operational, but with social distancing and remote learning. So looking at these diagrams, I'm sure a lot of you have seen these. They look like little umbrella drawings of the 6-foot distance. And then, so how do you look at that spatially? And then how do you actually look at being in consideration with shelter in place? So maybe some commuter students remain at home and you start to phase students back into classrooms. So what does that start to look like if we look at being fully operational, still keeping social distancing and the collaboration with remote learning? Because we know that our physical distancing is actually pretty straightforward. Colleges need to put either fewer students in the same space or the same number of students but in a larger space. So I think there's a lot of work going into those strategies. And we know that traditional lectures and lecture settings and active learning settings with the same capacity is just not conducive to the physical distancing current standards. And so when we approach physical environments, we may want to look at the short-term, near-term, and long-term solutions. In this example, this is a classroom. We also have these diagrams for resident life, dining, athletic facilities, but it's starting to take a look at, perhaps in the short term, you start out with perhaps 40% in person, 60% online. Maybe in the near term, you get closer to that 50-50. And then the long term, you look at maybe it's 75% students in person, 25% online, going towards that blended learning model. Institutions are saying that they're going to remove furniture to discourage students from sitting too close, designate specific exit and entry doors to classrooms, and redefine meeting rooms or event spaces to makeshift classrooms. We have some clients that are in warmer climates that are exploring tents or temporary structures, maybe outdoors, to be able to flex space a little bit and spread out for a short-term solution. And so with that blended model, when we pair the physical space with the virtual world, what does that blended model look like? I think for some faculty, they found that certain didactic classes could be taught online. So for those, I know that different schools are starting to consider a variety of ways to do this. So it might be considering focusing on core courses or signature experience courses, maybe eliminating low enrollment courses and prioritizing those that can adapt to different modalities. And others are looking at a split curriculum or block plans. And I know, so that's kind of interesting to think about how curriculum shifts might happen, as well as thinking about shifting the times of classes, maybe they're longer days, but not having as many students exit classes at the same time. So a shift in how just curriculum is developed in the fall, because I think we're really having this boundary tested between the virtual and physical environments. And then if we think about how could we be fully operational with managed cohorts, and think about this as more of a resilient campus approach. So is this going to be the last pandemic? Is there going to be another surge? Could there be another large crisis down the road? Again, we're not sure what the future holds, but perhaps there's a way for campuses to stay relevant with students physically on campus in a physically distanced world. So, could students shift to remote learning? And if remote learning or sort of that shelter in place, could they still be on campus? So I think campuses are looking how to safely handle the possibility of infections on campus while maintaining the continuity of core academic functions. So this does look a little bit broader, almost like a pandemic master plan. So it might be that you actually look to create areas where you can quarantine on site so that you don't have to shut down. So it's looking at the feasibility and affordability to quarantine on campuses so students don't have to go home if there becomes an infection. And I think in order to do this, what we've been talking with folks about is really testing almost needs to be a prerequisite. Campuses that are looking into this rapid testing when they first arrive on campus, and then maybe doing regular intervals throughout the year. I know there's a large number of enrolled students, so it seems like a daunting task, but regular testing might be the only way to prevent the silent spread through dorms and classrooms. And so there's digital technology companies that can help, and they're looking to adopt some mobile apps to trace the spread of diseases, and colleges and universities could play a role in collaborating with some of this data, and maybe there's a partnership with some health departments to make this a little bit more reasonable or feasible for some of the large universities. Because if testing is available and somebody tests positive, it might be interesting to consider a quarantine on-site community. Again, it can be costly and difficult and force institutions to innovate, but some universities and colleges are up to the challenge to think about what that might look like. So again, they can stay fully operational. In the future, a more resilient campus strategy could sustain some of these unknown scenarios, and it could potentially reverse some of these statistics and keep campuses afloat. So operationally, I think there's a lot of different protocols to take into consideration. Beyond space, there's a lot of considerations around protective equipment and supplies. I didn't share today some of the information about food and beverage and housing, but I know that there's a lot going into that. Do food and beverage services, at least in the near term, look to either shut down, or do they go to a takeout service or individually packaged operation? And so there's a lot of different scenarios within college campuses in the community that are being evaluated. But what are those protocols within this roadmap to return that could be near term and long term to test out? We talked a little bit about the learning environments, but cleaning and maintenance protocols, again, will be something that is tested, and that is something that will be really robust in the future. And then if we take a look at behaviors and messaging, communication has been nonstop with everything that's been going on, which is really great. And so by creating a task force to define the clarity of the messaging, I think that's going to be really helpful, and making sure that there's universal signage throughout campus and clear instructions. That'll all be really helpful to really define the messaging, to revamp the behaviors that are happening. And just following up with CDC and the World Health Organization to make sure that campuses are staying up to speed. And potentially creating move-in packets or return to campus preparedness welcome kits to really create a positive impact when students come back in the fall. And so there's a lot that I've thrown at you, and there's a lot to consider as far as best practices. And I do believe that there are some that are near term to be tested, and then some that may turn into long-term solutions. And so this is just a couple that we've talked about, but again, supporting that physical distancing. The blended learning model, we talked about staggering curriculum to de-densify campuses. And then thinking about some of those non-essential academic amenities, either on hold or just testing out different procedures. And I think, again, that shared space, at least in the near term, reevaluating what shared space really means. But then in the long term, the goal is really to take cues from the near term and use that as an opportunity to prototype and test strategies. We've been talking to campuses about creating a hands-free world, how we have automatic door operators, but putting those on all doors, and looking at less surfaces, less handles. I think the technology infrastructure is going to dramatically change. Healthy environments is always something critical for every single project, but more than ever, just making sure that that is integrated into all the projects. And then the mechanical filtration system, I think, is definitely going to change, as well as the hygiene requirements, protocols, and then signage. And spatially, I think it's taking a look at what has been working as far as online. You know, maybe there are fewer lecture halls because curriculum has shifted. People that are working from home, it's working for some folks. And so perhaps the office environments shift dramatically within the long-term solution by testing out the short-term.
Need to wrap up pretty quickly, Heidi.
Perfect. This is my last slide. Chris, that was great. So really this is just kind of a summary of what we've talked about. I do believe, after talking to some different tech companies as well as universities, that there could be some really interesting partnerships that go along with this, and ways for universities to just think a little bit differently than they have in the past, and being able to really adapt to some of these unknowns, and thinking about the future, and just how can you think more holistically to account for whether it's a future wave of a pandemic or any other unknowns, and just to kind of shift the story to from the negative statistics to really start to be positive, and think of how college campuses could be seen as an innovative trendsetter. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Heidi. It's really, in all of the sessions we're doing, it really is, there's a sense of folks being overwhelmed at how many changes have to be made, in this case for many schools for the fall semester. But it's also good to keep in mind that these changes all are not all for just a temporary period of time. They can contribute to a hybrid model of education going forward, and can certainly, as Heidi said, prepare schools for future pandemics. I just want to remind the audience to type in your questions. We're anxious to see questions and get them sorted for the Q&A session at the end. And now I want to introduce, from Minnesota State Colleges and Universities, Michelle Gerner.
Thank you, Chris. Can everyone see my screen all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be talking about some of the facilities strategies that the institutions of Minnesota State have been using in response to COVID-19. Just as a bit of background, who is Minnesota State? Essentially, we are all institutions, public higher education in the state of Minnesota, except for the University of Minnesota. So we have 7 universities, 30 colleges, and that includes community colleges, technical colleges, and the comprehensive colleges. So 54 distinct physical campuses around the state. And we serve about 350,000 or more students every year in a wide range of academic programs. So over the past few months, as we've suddenly made this dramatic transition to online and virtual learning, we've been talking to our students about what they prefer in terms of learning. And the response has overwhelmingly been that they prefer on-campus interaction. They really prefer being with their fellow students, meeting in person with faculty, getting services from the staff in person. And that lines up with what we've experienced in the past as something that's an important contributor to student success, especially for some of our underserved populations, such as first-generation students or Pell-eligible students. We find that having that on-campus interaction, being part of a campus learning community is really important to the success of those students and helping them succeed academically. In addition to that, we have a number of academic programs that simply can't be done virtually or through an online environment. So for those reasons, it's really important to us that we find ways to bring our students back to campus and bring them onto the facilities in a safe way. And there's also, for us, there's an equity component as well. We're fully aware that a number of our students just can't make online learning work for a variety of reasons. Some students don't have access to internet at home. They might not have a computer at home. Their phone might be their only computer that they own. In addition, some students might not have a safe home to go back to. So we want to be able to provide our physical facilities for those students so that they can come in and access those resources and everyone has a more equitable chance of succeeding academically. So with those concerns in mind, there are 4 facilities areas that we're keeping in mind as we develop our overall strategies for the system. And I just want to emphasize that because our system is so big and diverse, there's no one general set of guidelines that all of our campuses are using uniformly. Each campus develops its own strategy based on its student population and its mix of academic programs and whatever the leadership of that institution thinks is best for them. But 4 general areas that we're thinking about, first are the class labs, especially for the technical and trades programs, our general classrooms, the interaction areas where students, staff, and faculty generally meet with one another and interact, and then finally the residence halls and the dining spaces. So today I'll be just talking about some general strategies that our campuses are using in these 4 areas. First, taking a look at the class labs for technical and trades spaces. As we see here, there are some labs where each student station is essentially the same. There's distinct stations, but they have all the same equipment, and it's fairly easy to do some sort of social distancing within these classrooms because you can just close off, for example, every other station, or maybe the stations are big enough on their own where if one student is using per each station, there's enough physical distance already that we wouldn't need to close down those stations. And we can have a group of students in here, they're safely distanced from one another, and they can work on the equipment in person here. But on the other hand, we have also a lot of labs where, because of the type of instruction or the type of lab, getting that physical distancing just isn't really possible. And it's also difficult to do that group work that the students might have as part of the class without them being physically close to one another. So in this case, there are some facility solutions that we have, but mainly we're looking at the academic side to make some adjustments to how the program is taught or to how students access the lab and how they work with one another. And again, there are some spaces where working as a group is a critical part of using that lab. And so again, we'll have to make some adjustments as to whether we try to bring in some PPE, which is a challenge at the moment, or if we find new and different ways of having these students work in these lab spaces and still gain those skills that they need. Then taking a look at general classrooms, these are slightly easier to adapt for physical distancing. At the moment, as you're probably aware, groups of more than 10 are not really permitted on our campuses, but we're hoping that at some point in the future, we'll be able to have larger groups within our classrooms as long as social and physical distancing is maintained. So for classrooms like these, for example, we might be able to block off every other seat to get those seats distanced. When a larger class needs to be broken up like this, we'd also look at scheduling solutions, such as offering more class sections within slightly larger classrooms, or maybe even making the academic day a little bit longer. So it might start earlier in the morning and go until later in the evening so that we can fit in more of those sections that are smaller. And active learning classrooms, which are focused on group learning and learning from other students, we've been trying to encourage more of these types of classrooms within our system, but unfortunately, the more types of classroom you have like this, it makes it more challenging to do that social distancing, because once you start to block off some of those seats, any students who are trying to work in a group, they end up shouting across the table at one another. And then before you know it, you have a room full of people kind of shouting at one another. It gets very loud and chaotic. Or in the case of the classroom that's on the right here, when you block off half of the seats, suddenly you're working in a group of 2, which might not be as effective as trying to do group work in a group of 4 and getting those diverse perspectives. So again, this is something where we're looking at some diverse solutions from the academic side of things. One solution that some of our campuses have been considering is sort of a hybrid in-person type of strategy where it's a 1/3, 2/3. So in any given week, a large class like this would have 1/3 of the students in that class physically present in the classroom, while the remaining 2/3 are observing the class through live stream or a Zoom meeting from remotely online. So this allows students to work in some groups and they're not shouting over one another quite as much when they're in person. And then in each subsequent week, a different 1/3 of the class comes and experiences the class in person. So each member of the class is physically present in the classroom 1 week out of every 3. And that's just one of many solutions that we're taking a look at academically and scheduling wise right now. And then taking a look at the interaction areas. One of the primary areas of concern for us is those student services and tutoring areas where a student would be coming in to get counseling or to talk about financial aid, get some tutoring. So beyond the sort of obvious physical facility solutions like providing plexiglass screening, providing stations that give a little bit more physical distance between 2 people who are seated, we also will be looking at providing more services by appointment and less like as a drop-in service. That gives us the opportunity to sort of space the students out in time so that there are fewer students, for example, waiting in a reception area or waiting out in a hallway and having a hard time staying distant from one another. And of course, another option is to have remote service centers that are available via online chat or via video chat. So a student might use a computer lab on our campus or some sort of a kiosk to connect to a remote service person who could help them via video chat and help them work out their issues that way. And we could use a similar thing for tutoring. And then within faculty offices, the main concern there is when faculty need to meet privately with a student. Some of the faculty offices might not be big enough to get that 6-foot distance between the faculty and the student or multiple students. So what we recommend there is that students and faculty meet in conference rooms. And that means that you need a conference room that's big enough to hold 2 people or more while safely keeping them at a distance from one another. And we'd be asking people to reserve those ahead of time to make sure that we have enough capacity. And then looking at our residence halls and dining spaces, we've found that we still do have a fair amount of demand for residence halls looking into fall. Apparently all of the students who are currently at home with their parents and learning online from home, they're eager to get back on campus and away from their parents. So we're looking at, instead of having the traditional double or triple rooms, every room would be single occupancy. Some of the universities especially will be taking blocks of rooms within the residence halls and reserving those as quarantine spaces. Preferably this would be single rooms that have access to a private bathroom or sort of a limited access bathroom. And these would be spaces where if a student had been in close contact with someone with COVID-19, or if they were experiencing symptoms of COVID-19, they could temporarily move to one of these quarantine spaces. They would receive some services there. They'd be able to stay within that space until it was safe for them to rejoin the rest of the students. Within dining areas, distancing within the seating areas, limited seating are a couple of options that we would consider, as well as providing certain appointment times, sort of, when students could come and get dining so that not everyone is trying to get into that dining area all at once. And then looking at the various food service options, such as getting rid of some of the buffet options, more take and go options, and different ways of serving the food in a way that's safe for everyone. And overall, we recognize that residence halls were designed to be spaces where students are brought into a fairly dense environment, and it's difficult to do physical distancing, even with providing single rooms, even with spacing out the seats in our dining areas. We're going to be putting a lot of emphasis on students taking personal responsibility for themselves. So washing their hands a lot, trying to stay distant physically from other people as much as possible, being careful what surfaces they come into contact with. You know, we recognize that we want to provide a safe environment, but we want the students to be partnering with us to keep everyone safe. And just wrapping up some general guidance that we're talking about with all of our campuses. We want all of our campuses to be thinking about more no contact options. So that's no contact with physical surfaces, as well as reduced contact with other people. First and foremost, we want to be finding equitable solutions. As I mentioned earlier, equity for our students is very important to us, and we want to be thinking about all of the different challenges that our students have in having access to our facilities and having access to the academic opportunities, and making sure that the solutions that we provide are really taking those challenges into mind. And will require flexibility and creativity as we do this, because the environment is changing so rapidly. These solutions that we have as of today, they might be completely different by the fall. You know, we just need to be adapting constantly to new information that we're receiving, and really just doing our best to create a safe environment. And finally, I just want to emphasize that Minnesota State, we are open for business. We have summer classes coming online now. We anticipate having most of our campuses, if not all of them, open for fall. And we are also doing construction projects. We've got design projects going on, and also ramping up on pre-design. So if you're looking for work within our system, we are definitely still going forward with those items. So that's what I have for today. Thank you.
Hi, Chris, shall I go?
Sorry, I pushed on mute and didn't take. Sorry about that, Mark. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you especially for raising those equity considerations when we think about in-person versus virtual education. Mark, yes, it's time for you. This is the University of Minnesota's Marc Partridge. Mark, I think you're up on screen and ready to go.
All right, very good, thanks. I just want to echo the Chris's message of solidarity. Speaking for the University of Minnesota, it's been a rough couple weeks, but we're glad you could join us. I'm going to move pretty quickly because there's a little overlap with some of Michelle's work, but and some application maybe of Heidi's work. So I don't want to bore you with details. But similarly, they're just a quick overview for the university system. We're fundamentally a 5-campus system. The mothership is certainly the Twin Cities by a large margin. We also have 30 or 35, I believe, outreach centers scattered around the state. So we have about 30 million gross square feet of space to deal with. I'm going to focus, just because of our locale with our group, on the Twin Cities campus. But the thinking that we're all talking about certainly would extend to the outreach centers and the other 4 campuses. So one thing I wanted to remind people of, that welcome to the public sector. So there's a decision flow, and capital planning, which university architect resides within, is at kind of the tail end of the whip. So CDC makes some determinations for guidelines. The state of Minnesota picks up on that. The university has its own response in conjunction with that, called the Sunrise Plan. I believe we're in phase 2 of the Sunrise Plan related to COVID. The broader university services then takes those guidelines as recommendations, and finally there's capital planning. And it's been honestly a bit chaotic in terms of process. So they've just organized what we're calling a COVID operations group. I've been invited to attend, but I haven't been there yet, so we'll see. but they're meant to just get right a much more immediate and consolidated response to all the issues that Heidi and Michelle have raised. So the first thing is, yeah, who comes back? When do they come back? How do they come back? And we're looking at, like probably most universities, I am a member of the Association of University Architects, and it's a great organization of architects that get together. We've been getting together every week or two now just to combine ideas, and some of them are quite a bit further ahead of us, candidly. But these are kind of the strata of how we feel students will return. The good news is, echoing Michelle perhaps, our applications for fall are up. And so we're optimistic. We'll see how this all turns out. But we could see them coming back in kind of a scaled down, you know, fewer people coming back, certainly an online presence. You'll see an online presence in any one of these four options. Could be scaled up. We could have a lot more students on campus. More likely, we think, it will be this idea of a split curriculum where you've got both campus presence and then a lot of online learning as well. And I'll hedge on the variations of that scheme. And then least desirable, perhaps, I think, for a physical campus is online only. We also have staff. We've got about 4.4 million assignable. That's maybe 6 or 7 million gross square feet of office administration, faculty office. So the workforce is a big part of our thinking. And so who comes back? Right now, we have a very robust COVID research. We're part of the game. And so the pandemic respondents are here and working on campus, as you would expect. The academic strategy depends on that previous slide of how students return. The facilities, what can we do to get facilities ready? We've got 290 buildings. And then defining who's eligible staff-wise to come back. And frankly, who's ready to come back? I think right now, there's no employee who would be asked to come back if they were uncomfortable doing so. So then you've seen a lot of these diagrams. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but we're working, my part of this COVID group will be the physical distancing as opposed to social distancing, perhaps, but the physical distancing component of the campuses. And so that's physical, but we're also looking at flex, different ways to use space, certainly, but also different ways to use time. And that can be the staggered shifts that Michelle was talking about, staggered course loads, much more flexible work, working at home, working on campus, some hybrid of both. And then probably a phased approach as we ramp up. We're starting some of that work this summer in the hopes and the expectation that there'll be some sense of normalcy in the fall. So our group, the Capital Project Management Group, has put together a series of office guidelines. They'll look very familiar to you, so I won't spend a lot of time. The ubiquitous 6-foot radii and just applying it. We've used our floor. Our group resides in the Downhow building off Dinkytown, and so we're just using that as a model template to study what the issues might be, and they're very similar to all of you. We are landing on, I think, for workspace, the notion of probably shifts, that there may be alternating day, alternating seats. People would have their own seat for the sense of control and keeping cleanliness, but we could see alternating staff coming in. So this is kind of an overview of the overall floor, and then we're, as I'm sure most of you architects already are doing for your clients, taking a look at the seat count hits, you know, what it implies, going from 150 to maybe 60 or plus or minus within a work. It makes you question, I think, a little what collaborative workspace will mean if half your team is there, and just how we're going to surmount that. Circulation, we're trying to come up with, you know, perhaps there's just something that's applicable across campuses. maybe everything's clockwise. And so you really try and come up with the norms of 2 entrance points, all of the elevator, 1 or possibly 2 people in an elevator per trip. All of these mantras that I'm sure you're engaged with. Office space, Michelle listed, yeah, how does office space work for faculty and student guests if there's no room for them? So we have to kind of work on that. We are also probably defaulting in that case to conference rooms. But again, collaborative work, collaborative learning, and the amount of people in any one given space could be dramatically reduced. So it's clearly an issue. One thing we're wrestling with, we have our own codes department for the University of Minnesota, and they take their guidelines from the state of Minnesota. But right now we're in the heavy discussion of, okay, if you are going to separate and have distance separation within restrooms, what does that do to your counts and your compliance with codes? And so again, lots of conversation probably all summer on these things. Learning spaces, Michelle did a nice overview. We have a mix of formal lecture spaces, sometimes tiered, like on the left, and active learning space. It's a mixed bag. I mean, I think the density of active learning was already better just because of the way active learning spaces, classrooms are organized and how they operate. But you could see that you could control the student counts with fixed seating. There's a lot more control there. In an active learning, you can draw the 6-foot radii that you want, but people can move all the furniture, and so how you control this kind of environment is something we're wrestling with. We're also looking at residential and dining. I should say for the classrooms, everything Michelle listed, I'll just echo. We're looking at, alternating days or alternating weeks for class sections. We're certainly spreading classes throughout the day and into the evenings and possibly weekends, just to reduce the load. Housing and dining, we have no agreement. We're looking at all kinds of options. One thing we do have around our campus is a lot of off-campus housing and some off-campus hotels and motels, which, as you might expect, are not doing real well right now. So there's a thought that we could use some of those to spread out the student population in terms of residential. We are toying with the idea of allowing double occupancy as well as single occupancy. And again, these are just ideas. There's nothing clear yet, but roommates pick each other. You create a small family, if you will, or a small social circle. And other universities are kicking this around as well. We have a lot of residential suites with single bedrooms and then a common living space. That could work because students at least sleep in separate spaces. It's all a dialogue. I think dining, we're not sure. We could conceivably, kind of like restaurants are right now, you might order in advance. There might be a limited menu. It's boxed. You pick it up. One of the unexpected things that we're tangling with is just transit. The light rail cuts right through our Twin Cities campus, and then we also have our own inter-campus circulator, both within the campus to West Bank and the St. Paul campus. And 90% of the time, those are jammed with students. And so, we're thinking about learning spaces and living spaces, but just what is going to happen to the density of the campuses limited purely by transit is something I hadn't thought of. So I mentioned the Association of University Architects. It's kind of sobering. This is a great example of what other universities are doing, probably a little ahead of the University of Minnesota, where we want to be, where they're taking each environment and really mapping them out in terms of occupancy guidance, the distancing, and also engineering controls and cleaning. As you all know, though, a true moving target. We're learning more. We knew more about surfaces and cleaning surfaces than we did 3 weeks ago, for instance. So lots to keep abreast. And this is maybe my final thinking on this is thinking we've got some immediate implications. We certainly had a hit in revenue. We had to refund tuition. We had to refund housing and dining. We don't know what we're going to see there. Athletics, which you know, makes a lot of money for the university system, way down. So we're not sure what that's going to imply, both for facilities and staff. We are in the University of Minnesota is in the thick of the COVID race. We've got a lot of research going on. So we are stopping projects, construction projects that might in any way reduce their ability to get their work done. So that's been prime. But as Michelle said, we're open. Our design, you know, designing virtually, like most of your architects, I've got a design group and we're finding we haven't really skipped a beat. A lot of work is getting done. Thinking more long-term, we don't imagine we're going to redesign the campus in every aspect of it. Dean Tolar is the head of our medical school and pretty brilliant guy. He's in the midst of the COVID piece. And he's suggesting that a vaccine is going to, you know, not solve things, and we may have other pandemics, but it is going to, it's where he thinks the long-term solution is going to live. But as both Heidi and Michelle spoke of, you know, there are shifts that have happened. Flex work was already happening. Flex learning was already happening. There's simply going to be more of it. But we could see possibly less enrollment, possibly less revenue, and ironically for most campuses, a physical challenge of scaling down campuses in the future. That's something we hadn't really thought much about. And then again, just the intangibles of campus vibe. How does a physical campus feel alive when you don't have this crush of students between classes? And the whole notion, I think, of spontaneous collaboration and learning, if everything is intentional, if everything is regulated and planned out, there's an obvious loss of spontaneity that concerns us. But again, lots of design going on. And then just kind of my closing hope is that design is not just managing the pandemic, but maybe celebrating our culture in different ways. This is a piazza in Italy, of course. And they've simply added these squares to the square and implicit 1.5 meter social distancing, but you know, in a really engaged way. And I'm hoping that we can layer in this physical distancing in a more effortless way on our campuses. So thank you.
Marc, thank you so much. We've got just a few minutes left. We want to get to some questions so that you can hear from our panelists on the questions you all have posted. We've done our best to identify those that will be of broad interest and that went in particularly interesting directions. You know, we thank Sherry Hansen for compiling these. We have everyone back up on screen now, so let's dive in. I always like to start with a simple one that can elicit a shorter answer. One of the questions, we know what near term is, we know what immediate is, but what's the time frame you all are thinking of when you say longer term considerations? Are we talking January 2021, later in the year, 2022?
Well, I'll go for that just because I mentioned the long-term piece. We're following the vaccine lead, and I guess our expectations is that fall semester and probably winter semester are going to be really odd. But we would hope that by next summer, beginning of next summer, that there's a lot more knowledge and a lot more reaction that makes more sense. We're kind of thrashing around right now.
Great, thank you. Any thoughts on transition and circulation spaces? We talked about classrooms, active and lecture halls and dining facilities a little bit, but what about those spaces in between in corridors and pathways? Are there any immediate changes that can be made there to ensure safety?
Oh, well, I can take this one. I think from our perspective, it's not so much a facility solution as it is a scheduling one. We're starting to look at, is there a way that we can stagger those class times so that there are fewer students in those hallways at the same time? Maybe, you know, just a 5-minute difference would make enough, and then we're giving a little bit more passing time between classes so that it allows those students to space themselves out, and it also allows for maybe a little bit of additional cleaning in those classrooms in between classes, whereas if there was just maybe a 5-minute passing time on a smaller campus, there's not enough time to get in there and clean. But maybe if that's expanded to 15 minutes, you get in there to clean, and you also can space out those students within those passing areas outside. That's one of the strategies that we're looking at right now.
I know you don't want everybody to answer every question, but I'll just jump quick. We are thinking, depends on masks, quite honestly, at least in the near term. We've got a mantra of motion equal masks, and that's how we think we're going to solve. We have tight corridors. People are going to run right by each other. So we hope there could maybe be a little spontaneity, but maybe masks.
Here's a bit of a tougher one. There's been a lot of progress and momentum toward sustainable and energy efficient design, often led by student interest. Are there some near-term choices that need to be made in relation to COVID? Single-serve packaged meals, increased HVAC operation in hours, that sort of thing. What are some things that we can think about in terms of maintaining sustainable goals at a time when we need to make some immediate changes?
That is a hard one. I think what we've been talking about with different institutions is just kind of, as I was mentioning, how do you prototype different things in a small scale, and how can that make a big impact in a larger scale? And so I think as far as the sustainability goes, that is a huge concern that everyone is facing, as well as just time consumption with some of these processes that are being established. But I think it's something that needs to be prototyped if there's new standards, but at a much smaller scale. And as far as more of an infrastructure based, if we're looking at like creating negative pressure rooms, or more HVAC or different analysis in that regard, I think that would have to be done on a much smaller scale, and then ramped up moving forward with different construction. But sustainability within the food service, I think, is something that is being looked at holistically, and people are taking cues from the from different food services around the country. So I don't have a great answer. I think it's something that's being prototyped right now.
I've got a kind of side answer, I guess. One thing that we're finding interesting is, I talked about the revenue and the kind of hits there. Something I think we're trying to be really vigilant about relative to sustainability is, the B3 metrics, et cetera. We have a voluntary program if it's not state funded, and there's a lot of pressure to, cut corners on B3 and SB 2030 because of the cost of buildings, et cetera, et cetera. So we're just fighting the battle, and more to come on that, I'm sure.
Okay. Well, we're coming up on time. Two quick things as we close out. We first want to thank our speakers again for joining us today. I wish we could do an hour-long session with each of you and have a much longer Q&A. On behalf of our audience, thank you for your time. And finally, we want to again share the invitation to join us for upcoming webinars in this Future of Design series. The information that you see there will get you in the right place. You can register for these programs that are listed at the website at the bottom. Thanks, everyone. Please take care.
Thank you.